Welcome back. We've been exploring this idea of learning as a cyclic process. We want to shift gears just a little bit and move into a different part of learning here. And I need to tell you a quick story. In the mid-1950s, a group of educators got together and started asking themselves, can we come up with something that will provide a framework for teachers, instructors, educators with some consistency. So we're not all doing completely separate sorts of things. And what they came up with is something called Taxonomy of Educational Objectives. The editor of this was a gentleman by the name of Benjamin Bloom, and so it became known as Bloom's Taxonomy of Educational Objectives, or simply Bloom's Taxonomy. Then what happened was, a number of years later, 45 years later, a group of people got together, including one of the original authors of the original Bloom's Taxonomy, and said, well, we've got 45 years of use and research related to Bloom's Taxonomy. So we know a lot about this. People have used it, people have done research on it. Did we get it right the first time? And the answer basically was, yeah, they pretty much did. Now they made some tweaks to it, some relatively minor modifications in the grand scheme of things, and this became known as the new Bloom's Taxonomy or the revised Bloom's Taxonomy. This is the one that we're going to be using and talking about. But again, the important point here is that this is based upon, well, now it's much over 45 years of research and experience. So what is this? First of all, what we're going to be talking about is cognition, or what they call the cognitive domain. What is cognition? It's the mental action or process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experience, and the senses. Thinking. Think of it as thinking, cognition. They came up with 6 levels of this, what has become known as Bloom's Taxonomy of Educational Objectives. Again, this is the revised one. So what I've done here is to give you the definitions to make sure you understand what those words mean. We'll start from the bottom. Remember, to retrieve relevant knowledge from long-term memory. That's pretty basic stuff. Understand, to construct meaning by connecting new and prior knowledge. A little bit higher, but still pretty basic stuff. Apply, to use a procedure to perform exercises or solve problems. Analyze, to break material into its constituent parts and relate the parts to the whole. So here's the whole. I need to be able to break this into its parts, understand the parts individually, but also then how they relate to the whole. So that's a bit higher in terms of cognition and thinking. Evaluate, to make judgments based upon criteria or standards. We're making judgments. I have these 3 options. How do I decide which of those 3 options do I take advantage of or use? And then create, to pull elements together to form a coherent whole. I have a bunch of things. I'm going to pull those together and make something new for me. It may not be new for mankind, but it's a new idea, a new concept, or whatever. Okay, what I've done here in the yellow and the gold is to pull out a few words. So create, pull elements, put elements together. Evaluate, make judgments, analyze, break material into parts, use a procedure for apply, construct meaning for understanding, and retrieve knowledge for remember. Just simply so you kind of get these definitions, but in a much shorter form. Okay, so what I want you to do is take a piece of paper, find a piece of paper, and draw a box in the middle of that piece of paper with 6 rows, a grid just exactly like this. So grab a piece of paper and draw very quickly a box with 6 rows. And we're going to fill in those rows, and you can take notes on filling in those rows. The first level, the lowest level, we'll start from the bottom, is remember, simply retrieving knowledge. Next level would be understand. Retrieve the knowledge, now let's construct some meaning. What's the definition of the word? So I remember the word, what's the definition of that word, as an example. Apply is the next one, using a procedure. Higher level, but still fairly low level. Remember, understand, apply, analyze. Breaking into its parts. Again, the idea that you have a whole, do I understand the individual parts, and then how do those parts relate to the whole? Evaluate, making judgments. You do this all the time to your students, don't you? When you give them, when you grade their exams, grade their term papers, etc. Evaluate. It's a fairly high level of cognition of thinking. The highest level is create, putting elements together to make something new, different, whatever the case may be. Okay, Bloom's taxonomy. I will tell you that we're going to come back to Bloom's taxonomy again and again and again in these videos. It is, I hate to say this in this way, if there's nothing else you get from these videos, this is something you need to know. I rarely ever tell my students to memorize something. If you can't do it any other way, I would suggest you memorize this. Remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, create. Let's take this to a couple more levels here. First of all, again, thinking skills, lower order thinking skills, going up to higher order thinking skills. One more point here. We all want our students to learn about the topics we are teaching in our modules. We also would like them to be able to think critically about that knowledge, about that information, that knowledge, that topic. What exactly is critical thinking? Lots and lots of definitions of critical thinking, many, many books written about it and so on. Here's something that helps me a lot as I think about this, and that is to recognize that if my students are working at this level, analyze, by the very nature of what they're doing, they are thinking critically. If they're working at the level of evaluate, in terms of their learning of whatever it is I'm getting them to learn about, they are thinking critically. So not so much these levels, but as we go up, particularly these upper levels, that essentially is what critical thinking is in terms of action of what they're doing. So keep that in mind, not only about learning, different levels of Bloom, but also the fact that if we have our students working up here, we are accomplishing a lot of, in terms of how you think critically. Remember, thinking critically was one of those things that your stakeholders said that your students aren't doing all that well on, and very frankly, many of our students do not do that well on too. So we need to have them working more and more in terms of their learning up at these levels. Okay, how does Bloom's taxonomy relate to the brain model or the cycle of learning? Well, again, we control this part, sensory. This is kind of what's happening, kind of more or less where they're happening in the brain. I just kind of laid them out here. Remember, understand, remember, those are kind of happening here more or less, not exclusively here. But as you go up the line here, more and more of that's happening in that frontal integrative cortex. And our job is to pull that out of the student and have them cycle through.